Welcome to the Farm to School podcast, where you will hear stories about how kids' lives have been changed by growing, cooking, and eating local foods in schools.
We're your hosts, Rick Sherman
and Michelle Markestein. We are Farm to School coordinators for the state of Oregon.
In this episode, we're looking at a very small rural charter school in Oregon and how our guests transformed the grounds into an edible landscape. Ooh. Everyone, please welcome to the program Lua Siegel. Lua.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Hi, Lua. Edible landscape.
Yeah, that sounds pretty exciting.
It sounds delicious.
It is.
Hey, could you paint a picture for us of your school and what do you see every day?
Okay. So we are a public charter school. That means it's a free school.
What is that? Like some people in America might not know what a charter school is.
I know. That's why I had to say free, because some people sometimes think it's like a private, but it's a charter school. So one of the things that happened around, let's say about 15 years ago, many rural schools were at risk of being shut down because the attendance was very small and the districts might have thought it wasn't financially sustainable to keep them open. Right. So they threatened to close the schools, and there was a movement at the grassroots of families that decided that they really valued a school in their rural community. So they banded together and they created what was called a charter proposal. So they would receive public funds, but they would manage them and keep the school open. Some districts were open to that. Some might not have been. Dallas School District was open to a charter school within their area. You know, they went from dozens and 20s of children to now a full enrollment of about 240 with a wait list. So what we're seeing is that some charter schools, because they have certain flexibility while still receiving public funds, are creating programs that are attractive to mainstream population outside slightly of the rural area.
And so you said Dallas School District. I just wanted to do a little caveat that's Dallas, Oregon.
I was thinking Dallas, Texas.
No, we get that a lot.
Yes.
And I used to be the food service director there, and your building there was part of my school district back, 15 years ago when I was there. But I would either get emails saying howdy, hello from how is Texas, or how's the windsurfing in the gorge, and they would confuse us with the Dalles. And it's like, no, it's not the Dalles, it's Dallas. And so we would get confused a lot. So
it's the capital of Polk County, but it's relatively small.
It's a bedroom community of Salem, our capital in Oregon. And I loved that district. I coached cross country there in track for the 10 years. And I just love the community. It's really nice. And where you're at, it's called the Kings Valley Highway. It's in between Dallas and Corvallis, Philomath, and it's just beautiful area.
It is. It's a farming community, and I should probably correct. It was probably around 2001, 2002 that those charters formed. So that's more like 20 some years.
So you said a couple hundred students?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, and rural. So I'm curious of two things: do they have to travel far to get to your school?
Well, not that far, and we have buses. So students come, if you're familiar with Oregon, so we're out in the country about 5 minutes south of the town of Dallas. So they'll come from Dallas, Monmouth, Independence, and also from just outside the towns in the rural area.
And then being rural, are they already growing food at home gardens? And is it redundant in school gardens?
Not at all. Actually, not all of them are. And many of them might live in apartment complexes in these towns. So this is new to them. Some might have a house with some property, but they might not have a garden. And that's one of the things we started to experiment. I don't know if you want me to go into that, but this last year with the grant money, we had this novel idea that we could have this sort of reward system that parents who volunteered would be entered into a drawing, and they could win or they could have a garden bed built in their backyard, a yard of soil brought in, and some plant starts. And so we tried that out to start bridging that, that gap between the school and the family home.
Fabulous.
And we had 3 garden boxes built. And this fall, one of the students that had some tomatoes grown, she came over with a little Ziploc and said, "Miss Siegel, I have a gift for you." And it was a tomato from her garden bed. She was so excited. And that's so heartwarming.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And your actual building, do you know when it was built? It's an old school.
It is. It's so old we have no plans or records of how it was built. Those schools and the Kings Valley Charter School, they're from about the 1800s.
Yeah.
I know Kings Valley Charter School is 1848, and we're just up the road from them.
Yeah.
So,
and you don't have a kitchen. I remember when I brought food out there, we served from a hallway.
So we have two campuses. We have a PD, which is the middle school, and the elementary.
Yep.
Our elementary, which has the most amount of students, K through 5. It's just a sliver of a walkway of a kitchen. It's just for warming up food, so we can't cook on site.
No, and
Quote
just,
unquote cook.
And painting a picture of your grounds when I've seen the transformation there, and it just when you come there, it seems like every square inch is taken up by food growing, and there's just everywhere you look there is food, and it's quite an amazing story of like the grounds and your soil and water conservation district. Can you tell us about your actual grounds and where you your trials and tribulations of planting that garden there?
The way you describe it, I feel like maybe I'm an invasive species.
No.
So let's see. The school, well, when I was hired to begin a school garden with the vision of eventually growing food that would be integrated into what would become scratch meal preparation for the students. So the board had a very lofty long-term vision. And so they walked me to the back of the property where there was this little zone, like 25 by 30 feet along a seasonal creek. And they said, this looks pretty good. And I looked at the soil. Yeah, nice. And so, I started the traditional way of let's ask the community for a bunch of old hay or straw bales. And we got 40 dropped off. We made 5 rows with 8 bales each. Then it rained and it rained and it rained. And that seasonal creek became full of water. It overflowed and it dragged those 40 bales far and crashed into the fences. And then I thought, I think I need to learn a little bit more about the geography of where we are. Is this riparian?
Yeah.
Is this wetland? And so I reached out to the community and I invited the Lucky Mute Watershed Council. I invited Polk County Soil and Water Conservation. And, rely on your experts, right? And I'm not from Polk County. This was new to me. I live in Benton County. And so I invited them over and I asked them for some education. And they instructed me that this was wet prairie, that it seasonally floods, that it's not riparian. And in the past, Native American population, which in that zone is the Lucky Mute Kalapuya, would have cleared the ash, would have opened it up for deer to come in for hunting, and camas are abundant. We've seen them on our property. So it's okay to clear some of the zone for food preparation. And so that gave us some permission. I didn't want to be, harmful to the environment. But then I started looking, well, maybe it's not the best idea to be right by the seasonal creek. So I started negotiating and say, how about you give us 14 feet of this field, which is a play field. So we created a 14 by 100 foot garden. Mm-hmm. And we did that in year 1. Year 1 was the first year right after COVID. Then that got built so fast. We started looking at the front of the property, and the school had wanted to do a rebuild, but in our relationship with the county and being in the floodplain, there was no way we'd ever put a building. So I said, well, you do really want to grow food for your meals. How about we do another garden there? So now we have a 50 by 100 foot garden. And then we still enjoyed this, the whole vision that the Polk County Soil, Water, and the Watershed Council gave us, that it was really important to do some native restoration. And so
what do you mean by that, native restoration?
So bringing in, we had some Scotch broom back there, blackberries, those are all invasive species.
Oh, for those of you not in the Northwest, in Scotch broom, if you haven't had to experience that, I don't know how to, it's pretty.
Yes, it's beautiful.
Somebody, I assume from Scotland, I guess, about in the 1800s, brought that stuff over. And it takes over our whole landscape. It's everywhere. And it drives me crazy with my hay fever when it blooms. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, so I just know that's an issue in that valley. We were considering, when you open up, then you expose more to sunlight. So what are you going to bring in, And so we might as well bring in the native plants that inhabit this area And so, and looking at how the front patch connected to the back, well, how about we do, and the kids, they loved cutting those trees. And we did cut some hawthorn, which is a native plant, but they're a little bit too pokey and more than we needed. So the kids were just awesome about sawing down. We created a trail. Cardboard is my love language. Don't give me flowers, bring me stacks of cardboard. We covered all the ground with cardboard, then bucket after bucket of wood chip. We made a whole trail. And then we're like, well, what if we connect the back trail to the front trail and have native plants all along? So then the vision just kept growing and growing. And I think still continuing the initial intention of, millennial populations who have used this area to eat, and to forage. And so we continue using this land for that purpose. We've introduced, some edible plants that maybe are not native to the area, but I think we continue the spirit of the use of the land for being attractive to flora, and then have to fauna, and then to humans.
It's just so inspiring to me that, there's nothing wrong with, just plant a garden, grow carrots and do whatever. But the thought you put into that and to honor, like I've never heard of like a wet prairie, that's a thing. And just to find that out and go, okay, so knowing that, now I'll plant my garden, and then paying special attention to the native plants like you did, and the community and stuff. It's just really cool.
Well, and you were mentioning that the whole impetus for this was to grow food for the school meals. Mm-hmm. So what kind of crops and foods are you growing?
Let me add a little bit to, being aware of your geography, this whole thing of the wet prairie, a lot of modifications have been made to the land in our valley. We were just really fingerling like tributaries, and that we channeled and made our rivers, for logging and for agriculture. But something that I'm also trying to be mindful is when the school board hired me, they wanted to use regenerative farming. So I love that they had a vision of sustainability and conscious interaction with our land and our soil. And so in the wet prairie, one thing I'm trying to explore is, how do we, instead of the tiling that was done in the past to channel water away, how do we use the water that sits for parts of the year to maybe advance some dry farming? So we've piloted with OSU and Extension. We did some dry farming trials out there and such. Anyway, so the food that we're growing, okay. So, in the beginning, it's all about building and see what survives, right? It's a trial by fire. And then when you actually have production, then you have new questions like, oh, where do we store this? Or, oh, the kitchen can't process. Oh, our kitchen staff isn't trained or, have the ability. And so now we're in those growing pains, right? And so we found, I don't know how, a little greenhouse, a little refrigerator in the cafeteria. We put produce in there, and then it stopped working and it rots. So, so we're going through those things. My house smells like a market stand because all the tomatoes are in my living room right now. But I think where we're at right now is using it in our gardening class. So we'll pick and we'll eat right there. We'll purchase from local farms. We have a little grill, so we cooked up some corn on the cob and ate it right there in gardening. That's why I said quote unquote cooking. It's delicious and the kids love it. We've been sending produce home. With the middle school, we cook. So and at the elementary, we processed the tomatoes and our garlic and made some salsa, which the kids loved. And, you hear funny things like, I don't like salsa. Well, you don't have to like it, but if you could try it, that would be so awesome. You'd be so brave. And then they see their friends try it. So they try it and they go, oh, I usually don't like salsa that my mom gets, but I like this one. Can you give her the recipe? And I'm thinking, a lot of store-bought salsa is canned. So it's the cooked tomatoes. Kids aren't, so much a fan of cooked tomatoes, but that fresh salsa is a whole other thing. And so now they're going home with the recipe and going, I want this salsa. So
that term we always hear in farm to school and school garden coordinators, don't yuck my yum. You ever heard that? Yeah,
we have a little pre-lesson, right, before we eat about how we politely express our feedback. And it's okay not to like something, but we want to be careful for a few reasons. One, because the friends around us might like it. And so we don't want to hurt their feelings. Somebody worked hard to make this. So we want to show gratitude for the person that worked. Somebody worked hard to grow this. So we want to be respectful of the farmer, the grower. And so those three things we take into consideration. And it's okay if you don't like it. There's a compost bucket right here. You can throw it away gracefully. But all we want is for you to try it. And it goes a long way.
So about that cooking, I know you have a partner in crime in this. I've met a few times Juliana that comes in as a chef, and she makes amazing, wonderful food, which I've had. You tell me about your relationship with her and how that started.
So we were so fortunate last year. We had this funding from the Department of Ed. So we were able to contract her. She's a nutrition specialist. She's also, a trained social worker therapist. So she has lots of background experience and a passion for mental health. And using the small group food preparation setting is also, for personal development and students. And so she came in a few times last year and facilitated middle school cooking activities. And she's from Brazil. So she also integrated some pan de queso, which is a cheesy bread made with tapioca flour. So we had a little mini lesson with, where's Brazil in the world? What's the recipe? Then the kids broke up and they made this, and so on and so forth, different activities.
Yeah. And so, and the other part of that is, and you kind of glossed over it, but you said the board had a vision of scratch cooking, but you haven't said, but you're a full-time school garden coordinator. You're hired by the board,
Yes.
right?
And I am fully aware of my position of privilege, that I am hired full-time with a teacher salary to teach gardening to our
awesome.
240 students. So that's 10 different classes that I teach every week. That gives me time to teach and have a full day, which is program management. So grant writing, administration. I do the procurement grant, the fresh fruits and vegetables grant. So all those nutrition grants I do as well. I manage those. I do the reporting. I do the networking.
It's such a good model. Michelle and I, we always talk about this too, but in the regular K-12 world, it's in the nation, it's probably one of the biggest things is to get paid. It's usually volunteer help. And when the volunteer leaves, so does the garden. And so I've seen private schools, and this isn't a private school, but the model of this is like, we have your own board. You can do that. I've seen that be more popular, and we're getting better. Right, Michelle? We're moving the needle all the time. We've talked about this before, but we're getting more part-time and full-time positions in this, but it's been a struggle. We always say, whatever you're teaching, teach it outside.
Absolutely. Well, the school wants to move towards project-based learning, so they already have this in mind. And, I have to say, this isn't the way everywhere. I've worked at other places. So this is novel. When I was brought into this school, they definitely wanted me to work there, but I asked on my own to interview the board because I wanted to be sure that they owned it, because, when parents or PTOs, I've seen so many school gardens start and stop because it was a grant through a college. It was a parent volunteer. It was a PTO, and all those are disintegrated with the school. The teachers don't know how to use it, or then the gardens go fallow. And I think, this is a soapbox for me, is it doesn't do justice to the educational process to make these pet projects, and I'm a big proponent of social justice through education, and also, and think in being realistic about how I'm funded. I'm not funded through regular school ADM. So our school, I don't really know the logistics, but they have this extra SIA fund, student investment account, where schools had to make proposals of where they wanted to grow, some extra things they want to do. And so they got this extra grant, I guess, to fund a school counselor. Maybe their PE is partly funded, and a school gardener. That was their priority. So that's how they're using their SIA funds.
But the bingo moment for me in listening to Lua say this is just like our previous guest. We just uploaded Kelly Douglas. You both don't take no for an answer. You created essentially, you went and said, you should hire me to do this. And that's just such, it takes a special kind of person to do that. And I wish I could bottle that and sell it,
I'm still working on that. I'm not a person that's really good at self-advocacy, but I worked at another school where, I mean, I was in the privileged position of a husband that made a lot of money, so I could afford to sort of volunteer work. Mm-hmm. They paid me $500 a month to teach 5 classes a week with zero budget. And so that developed into a big program with loads, 20 hours of volunteering a week. But it taught me what it takes. And then once I had to earn an income, I could describe it, I could articulate it. So, my life trained me into being able to articulate what was really necessary.
And you're being too humble, though. Like, I know, like, you're talking about self-promotion or whatever. You do one of the best jobs. As I said yesterday, we were at a school garden meeting, mm-hmm. and you do one of the best jobs I've seen at like a daily Facebook post of your wonderful gardens. And we'll include a link in the show notes to your Facebook page. Mm-hmm. And if you don't mind, your contact information, so you can send them your newsletter. Totally. I mean, we have copies of them right here.
Yeah, and volunteering 20 hours a week isn't something someone does casually. So I'm very curious, what is your why? Like, what motivates you to do that?
Oh, big question. Well.
And piggybacking on that, how did you get your start doing that?
So my why, it's a life story. One of my earliest memories, so I grew up in Chile. My parents went to Chile when I was 1 month old. That was in 1972, which, was a bizarre thing for Californians to go to a communist or a socialist country. They thought my parents were crazy. They were brave. And I think it was the best decision they ever made for me to grow up in Chile. So one of the towns that we lived in is Punta Arenas, which is down on the Straits of Magellan, very far. Highways didn't you had to go through Argentina to get there or fly. It was expensive to get produce. So my dad had a greenhouse and a garden. And I remember I was kind of a naughty kid. And if I had a timeout and my bedroom had a lean-to greenhouse, I would jump out my window into the greenhouse and pick a tomato that was just turning red, slightly green. I'd get some salt and eat it and, make faces at my parents out the window. So there, I guess that was my introduction to the empowerment of growing your own food, and I guess that ties into justice, the empowerment. And then, fast forward many years, I just always had an interest in environmental themes. I'm a child of the 80s. So issues like drought in Ethiopia and hunger, that just touched me. I just always had a sensitivity to human suffering. And so when I was in high school, I decided to study bioengineering, which was a new development at that time. It had all this promise to solve world hunger. Now, we have all this fear of GMO, blah, blah, blah. But in that time, for me, it was an issue of justice and food and innovation of science to reduce hunger. But I took a gap year after high school, which back then maybe wasn't as cool as it is now in the 80s. And I went to a rural school in the south of Chile, which is the Mapuche zone. It would be equivalent to reservations in the United States, where it's a part of the country where most of the Mapuche population live. And so I was there in a school that had a boarding facility doing some volunteer work. I was only 17, very naive, learned a lot, about my position of privilege. And there was a woman there who had an organic garden that was part of the school, right there on the school site. And that was one of my first more systematic mentors. And I also realized, there were some disheartened teachers and hopeless teachers. And I realized what the world needed was educators. That if I wanted to promote social justice, the cornerstone is education. So I decided to study education. So then fast forward a bunch of years and very unexpected circumstances, I find myself in Oregon, United States, which I never intended to come to. I had a mission in Chile and rural education. That was my thing. Funny that that's where I am now. Again, my position of privilege and privilege as a parent and how to raise children was then tested by having a child with very high, very unique behavioral needs, very high needs. And it changed everything for me. I couldn't leave the home. Transitions were hard. There were outbursts. There was violence. And it threw me into probably, one of my second postgraduate degrees in psychology with all the books I was reading and techniques I was practicing. And I found that animal therapy worked very well. And so then I started to learn a lot more about the hands-on effect on these dysregulated, mostly boys. I started to see that this is a trend. And so I learned a lot and I practiced, and my child is a very well-adjusted 18-year-old right now, thankfully. And so then I started there was this position as a gardening teacher in the school, and that's then how I got in. It was 5 hours paid, but mostly volunteer. But that was the one thing I could do while still being present for my child. And if I had to leave because there was an outburst, then the flexibility. But my why has deepened. It's from love of food, the empowerment of growing your own food, promoting justice and accessibility to food, distribution of resources. That's just a passion for me, equalizing the distribution of resources. Coming from Chile to the United States, seeing how much, I'm sorry to say, but waste that exists in this country because we have abundance and wealth. And so it's hard to have perspective when you've grown up in that wealth. And I try to bring that into my practice. Last year I was a mega grant winner and got, $100,000, but I still want the kids to know how to build with a scrap wood from a fence that was taken down. We're not going to discard stuff. We're going to be resourceful. We're going to be conscious and grateful. And so that ties into the bigger why, which is a philosophical thing. And we all have, mantras and phrases. And mine is, and this is a quotation that talks about humanity, the generality of humanity, not a gender, but regard man as a mind rich in gems of inestimable value. Education can alone cause it to reveal its treasures and enable mankind to benefit therefrom. And so to me, every child...
Where is that from?
Oh, you're going to have to just Google it. Every person is a mine. And my job as an educator, and this is the only thing that helped me survive my son. He was coming at me with tools, violence, injuring a sibling. It was scary. It was scary. The only thing that keeps me going is if I really believe that in the nobility of every human being, that there is a mind full of gems, and my job is to discover and unlock those, not only for themselves, but the benefit of others. And there's the justice. We can't disregard the interdependence of the individual and the community in which they are embedded.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking of your son and so many other students and myself as a student who really struggled in school, I found so often it was the adults kind of like, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you succeeding? And a feeling really deep of failure and not doing it. And I think of a plant. And if a plant wasn't thriving, we wouldn't say, you stupid plant.
Gosh, yeah.
What would we do? We would water it more. We would make sure it has enough sunlight. We'd see if the nutrients were there. And if worst case scenario, we would transplant it. But we would never throw out a plant.
Yeah. Well, that's in the bigger journey that we're on, right? Because I see it a lot. And I do see sometimes there are children that are just not making it in the mainstream, and it's so hard, and it would seem to be easier to assist them to move on somewhere else and not adapt or modify or try ways to respond to their needs. And it's complex. Nothing is as simple as we wish it to be. That's something you learn over your life. And maybe schools don't have the resources, but I think the metaphor is accurate. I think when we see every individual, just like we do the plants, and maybe that's what we're doing, with children, is when we're working with those plants and responding to them, or going, well, why is the ash here? Or why is the beetle doing this to the ash? Or why is the tomato happy in this plot and not in this plot? Maybe these experiences will allow them as children and later as adults to process, because we learn from our natural environment. And we've lost, I think, in our education, the ability to observe patterns and learn from nature. And I think we're not just growing plants here. We're growing conscious individuals that will use those patterns in the world of physical creation to understand abstract concepts, develop human relationships that are, constructive and harmonious. And so I think what we're doing is a big thing. It's more than teaching them to eat, Yeah. Which is why I post so much. I think to me, not just to share my thing, but I love to learn. And I want to hear always what others are doing, which is why I keep pestering you about the hub for Polk County. Because not just to share our stuff, but I just want to be with people that want to learn. And that's
it's
the exciting
so
thing.
evident with her. Like she shows up at every opportunity, like
now
any
that I can leave the home. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know. I'm still stuck in my, thing. Thank you, Lou.
Thank you for having me. It's been a treat.
And we'd like to thank all of you listening for tuning in today.
Yeah. Thank you, Lewis, so much. The Farm to School podcast was written, directed, and produced by Rick Sherman and Michelle Markestein, and was made possible by a grant from the United States Department of Agriculture.
The content and ideas presented in this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Oregon State University, the Oregon Department of Education, or the United States Department of Agriculture. The USDA, Oregon Department of Education, and Oregon State University are equal employment opportunity employers.
Do you want to learn more about Farm to School? Check out other episodes and find show notes and much more at rootopia.com. That's ROOTOPIA.com. Rootopia is a project of Oregon State University.
Or do you have an idea for a future episode of the Farm to School podcast? We'd love to hear it. Send us an email at info@rootopia.com.
That's it, everybody.
Bye,
Thank you
y'all.
so much,
Thanks,
Lua.
Lou.
Say goodbye, Lua.
Thank you. Goodbye.